A woman with 17 cents in her pocket and a dead husband's broken watch stands alone on a frozen street in a town where nobody knows her name. The stagecoach that brought her here just cracked its axle. The boarding house slammed the door in her face. Night is falling, the temperature is dropping below zero, and she has roughly 4 hours before the cold kills her. Then a stranger walks out of the general store. A man with a scar carved from his ear to his jaw and eyes that look like they've already buried everything worth loving. He says 5 words. "I have got a cabin." She follows him into the dark, knowing that if he kills her tonight, no one on earth will come looking. But here's what she doesn't know. There are 2 graves behind that cabin, a wife and a baby. And hidden inside a wooden chest, beneath 2 pairs of tiny, unworn baby shoes, is a letter that begins with the words, "I am frightened of him." She just moved in with a man whose dead wife left a warning. And the worst part? She's carrying a secret of her own. One written in blood on a kitchen floor 1,000 miles away. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk channel, where the sun sets slow, the stories cut deep, and love rises from the dust of the untamed West. If frontier romance and cowboy heartbreak speak to your soul, you found your home. This story reminds us that home is not a place you find. It's a choice you make every single day with someone brave enough to stay. And sometimes the people most worth loving are the ones who've been broken the deepest, because they know exactly what it costs to try again. If this opening already has your heart racing, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, would you have followed the stranger into the dark? Share this story with someone who believes in second chances. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tap that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's ride into the night together. Eva Merritt had died once already. Back in Missouri on a cold kitchen floor, blood pooling between her thighs as she understood that the child inside her was gone. Now, standing in the middle of Willow Junction with 17 cents and not a single soul on earth who knew where she was, she wondered whether dying a second time would hurt more than the first. The stagecoach axle had cracked coming into town. She heard it before she felt it, a sound like a rifle shot followed by the whole coach lurching sideways, and then the driver cursing loud enough to scare the horses into a half-gallop before he wrestled them still. Eva gripped the window frame and held on while her carpetbag slid across the bench seat and hit the far wall with a soft thud. When the dust settled and the driver climbed down to inspect the damage, she already knew what he would say. She had spent 8 months learning to read bad news in the set of a man's shoulders, and the driver's shoulders said everything. He did not look at her when he delivered it. "Axle is cracked clean through," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "We are done for today, maybe tomorrow, maybe longer. Depends on the blacksmith, depends on parts from Denver." Eva stood on the main street of Willow Junction, Wyoming Territory, November 1873, and tried to remember how to breathe. The wind hit her face like an open hand. It smelled of horse manure cut with wood smoke, and underneath that, the flat mineral scent of frozen earth. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in a saloon, one key badly out of tune, repeating the same sour note like a toothache that would not quit. She clutched her carpetbag against her chest. Inside it were 3 dresses, a broken pocket watch that had stopped at 3:47, which was the exact time Thomas died, though she never told anyone that, and 17 cents in a small cloth purse. That was everything Eva Merritt owned in the world. The town stretched before her in a single line, weathered buildings with paint peeling in long strips, a general store, a saloon, a feed and grain supply, a blacksmith shop where her broken stagecoach now sat looking sad and useless, and at the far end, a white church steeple pointing toward a sky the color of old iron. She walked to the boarding house first. It sat on a side street behind a picket fence with lace curtains in the windows and a hand-painted sign that read, "Rooms available. Respectable ladies only." The woman who answered the door was thin as a fence post with gray hair pulled back tight enough to stretch the skin at her temples. Her eyes moved over Eva the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Calculating weight, estimating value. $2 a week, the woman said. Cash in advance. No exceptions. Eva opened her mouth and then closed it. $2. She had 17 cents. The distance between what she had and what she needed might as well have been the distance between the Earth and the moon. I see, Eva said, and the words tasted like ashes. The thing is, my stagecoach broke down unexpectedly, and I was not prepared for the extra expense. If I could perhaps arrange to pay when I reach Silver Creek. Cash only, the woman said. Her expression did not change, did not soften, did not flicker with anything resembling human sympathy. No credit extended, breakfast included, supper costs extra, no male visitors. I am afraid I do not have $2, Eva said, and the admission felt like pulling her own teeth out with pliers. The door closed with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Eva stood on the porch staring at the painted wood and feeling something hard and bitter climbing up her throat. She wanted to knock again, wanted to explain that she was not asking for charity, that she was a respectable widow who had simply run into a string of bad luck. But she knew it would not matter. The woman behind that door had made her assessment in 5 seconds flat, and nothing Eva said was going to change it. She walked back toward Main Street as the afternoon light began to fail. The November sun hung low and pale, offering no warmth, only the promise of a cold night coming fast. Eva's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. The church, the livery stable, the alley behind the general store, each option worse than the one before it, and all of them ending the same way. Alone in the cold with 17 cents and the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake coming west. She stopped in front of the church. The door was locked. A sign read, "Services Sunday Only, Reverend A. Mills." She sat down on the steps and put her carpetbag in her lap and stared at the empty street. She had traveled 1,200 miles to reach a place where nobody was waiting for her. Now she sat on the steps of a locked church, and God, if he was in there, had bolted the door. A brief memory surfaced like a fish breaking water. Thomas, in the mine company hospital. His hand gripping hers so tight she could feel the bones shift. His mouth moving but no sound coming out. And then his fingers going slack one by one like a rope unraveling. She had held on even after his hand went limp. Held on until a nurse gently pried her fingers away and said, "He is gone, Mrs. Merritt. You can let go now." But Eva had not let go. Not really. She had simply transferred her grip from Thomas's dead hand to the idea that somewhere out west, in a town called Silver Creek, her cousin Martha ran a dress shop and had once written that there would always be a place for family. That letter was 3 years old. Martha might have moved, might have married, might have died, but it was all Eva had, and she had crossed half the country on the strength of it. And now she sat on church steps in a town that was not Silver Creek, with no way to get there and no money to survive until she could. The temperature dropped as the sun sank. Eva could feel the cold moving through her coat, through her dress, settling against her skin like a second layer of clothing made entirely of ice. She began calculating. How long could a person survive outside in this weather? She had read somewhere that hypothermia could kill in 4 to 6 hours. The sun would be fully down within the hour. That gave her until midnight, maybe, if she found shelter from the wind. She stood up. The livery stable. At least there would be straw and the body heat of horses. She picked up her carpetbag and started walking. She almost did not see the man coming out of the general store. He was carrying a crate stacked with supplies, and Eva was so lost in her own spiraling thoughts that she walked directly into his path. She stumbled. The crate shifted in his arms. Her carpetbag hit the boardwalk and burst open, spilling a cotton dress and the broken pocket watch onto the frozen dirt. She smelled him before she saw him properly. Tanned leather and dried grass and something else she could not name. Coffee, maybe, or the particular scent of a man who spent his days working in open air. A hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The grip was firm and calloused, and it held her just long enough to make sure she was not going to fall, and then released. "You all right?" he said. His voice was low and rough, not unfriendly but unused. The voice of a man who did not talk much and had no practice at making it pretty. Eva looked up and the words died in her throat. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a work-worn coat, dark hair that needed cutting, eyes the color of creek water in winter. But it was the scar that held her attention. A thick, jagged line running from his left ear down across his jaw to the corner of his mouth, pulling the skin into a permanent slight twist. It was not a scar from any accident. Eva had seen enough of the world to recognize the work of a blade. She stared at it, not with revulsion, not with fear. She stared at it the way you stare at something you recognize. Because Eva had scars too. Hers just did not show on the outside. "You are the woman from the stagecoach," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He set the crate down on the boardwalk and bent to pick up her spilled belongings. His hands were large and careful as he folded the cotton dress and placed it back in the carpet bag along with the broken watch. He did not comment on either. He handed the bag back to her. "Where are you staying?" he asked. Eva hesitated. Pride and desperation fought a brief, savage war inside her chest, and desperation won. "I am working on that," she said. "Boarding house turned you away. There was no point in lying. I do not have the money." "Hotel, same problem." He studied her for a moment. Not the way the boarding house woman had studied her, measuring and dismissing. He looked at her the way you look at something broken that you're trying to figure out how to fix. "Nobody sleeps outside in this weather," he said. "I have got a cabin about 8 miles out. Extra blankets. Warm fire. You can stay until the stagecoach is fixed." He said it the way a man might say the sky is blue or water is wet. A simple fact requiring no elaboration. "Name is Silas Boon." Eva stood there on the boardwalk of Willow Junction with the cold biting through her coat and the dark coming on fast, and 17 cents to her name and nowhere on this earth to go. Every instinct drilled into her since childhood screamed that this was dangerous. A woman did not go off alone with a strange man into empty wilderness. That was how women disappeared. But she watched him walk to his wagon and load the crate among the other supplies, careful to keep the flour sacks away from the egg crate. She watched him speak softly to his horses. 2 sturdy bays with winter coats just coming in, rubbing one behind the ears until it nickered and pushed its nose against his chest. She watched his hands, the way they moved with patient precision. Never rough, never careless. A man who was gentle with his horses, she thought, was unlikely to be cruel to a stranger. She picked up her carpet bag and followed him to the wagon. As the wagon pulled away from town, Eva looked back at Willow Junction sinking into darkness. 17 cents in her pocket. Not a soul alive who knew she was here. If this man killed her tonight, no one would come looking. She turned forward into the dark that swallowed the road whole, and decided that if this was how she died, at least she had tried to live one more day. Silas Boon did not save the woman out of kindness. He saved her because if she froze to death on Main Street while he had an empty room, he would have to dig another grave. And 2 was already more than he could bear. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands loose on the reins, and tried not to think about the way she sat beside him on the wagon bench, straight-backed, chin level, hands folded tight in her lap as if she was holding herself together with sheer grip strength. She had the same look Rebecca had when they first arrived out here. The look of someone pretending to be strong while the seams were coming undone underneath. He did not want to notice that, did not want to see it. But the prairie had a way of stripping things bare, and the woman beside him was already stripped down to something raw and true and painful to look at. The road stretched out ahead of them, into nothing. That was the thing about the plains that people from back east never understood until they stood in the middle of it. There was no end. No boundary. The horizon was not a line, but an absence, a place where the earth simply quit and the sky started. The wind came from everywhere at once, and it never stopped. It moved through the grass like something alive, and at night when the sun went down, the darkness did not fall. It rose. It came up out of the ground and the grass and the hollows in the earth, and it swallowed everything. Eva asked him a question, something about how long he had lived out here. He answered in 4 words. 5 years, since '68. She asked another. He gave her 3 words back. He was not being cold. He had simply forgotten how to hold up his end of a conversation. The last person he had talked to for longer than the time it took to buy supplies was Joe Wheeler. And that had been 3 weeks ago, and most of what Joe said did not require a response. The longest sentence he managed on the entire ride was, "Watch the rut there," when the wagon wheel caught the edge of a washed-out groove in the road and jerked hard to the left. Eva grabbed the bench seat. Their shoulders touched briefly, and Silas pulled away as if he had been burned. They were a mile from the cabin when the wolf appeared. It stood in the middle of the road, a big gray male, alone. No pack, just one animal with its head low and its eyes catching the lantern light in 2 bright points of yellow. The horses saw it first. The bay on the left threw its head up and tried to shy sideways. The other one locked its legs and refused to move. Eva went rigid beside him. He could feel the tension radiating off her body like heat from a stove. Silas did not panic. He held the reins steady with his left hand and reached slowly for the rifle with his right. He did not raise it. He just rested his hand on the stock and waited. The wolf stared at him. He stared back. There was a time not so long ago when Silas Boon would have pulled the trigger without thinking, when the thing inside him that Shiloh had left behind would have answered any threat with violence, immediate and overwhelming. But he was not that man anymore. He had spent 5 years killing that man and burying him in the same ground where Rebecca lay. The wolf held its position for 10 seconds, 20. Then it turned its head, slow and deliberate, and walked off the road into the tall grass. It did not run. It vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next the grass had swallowed it whole. Silas clucked to the horses and they moved forward, shaking their heads and blowing hard through their nostrils. He did not say anything, but he knew Eva had noticed. The calm, the control, the way his hand had not trembled. This was a man who understood danger, her silence said. The question was whether the danger was pointed outward or inward. The cabin appeared as the last light bled out of the sky. A low structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch running along the front. Behind it, a line of cottonwood trees and the sound of running water from the creek. A barn, a chicken coop, a corral where 2 horses watched their approach with lazy interest. And behind the cabin, barely visible in the failing light, 2 wooden crosses standing in the frozen grass. Silas hoped she could not see them in the dark. He was not ready to explain those. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and climbed down. Offered his hand to help Eva from the bench. She took it. Her fingers were ice cold, and he noticed she was shaking, though whether from the temperature or from something else he could not tell. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, smelling of old wood smoke and dust, and the particular scent of a place lived in by a solitary man who had stopped caring about comfort a long time ago. Silas lit the kerosene lamp, and warm light spread across a single large room, a stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, a dry sink with open shelves holding tin cups and plates, a bed against the far wall covered with a patchwork quilt, and that was everything. No decorations, no personal touches, no pictures or curtains or flowers or anything that suggested joy had ever lived here. It was the loneliest room Eva had ever seen, and she had seen some lonely rooms. She stood in the middle of it and looked around, and Silas watched her look, bracing himself for the judgment, for the pity, for the careful neutral expression that people wore when they did not want to say what they were thinking. But Eva Merritt looked at the cold, bare cabin where Silas Boon had been slowly dying for 3 years, and she said one word: warm. Something in his chest cracked, a small sound like ice giving way on a creek in early spring. Not a break, just a shift, just enough to let something through that had been frozen solid for a very long time. He built a fire. He worked efficiently, coaxing kindling into flame, stacking larger logs until the fire crackled and heat began pushing back the cold. Then he pulled blankets from a chest near the bed and made up a pallet on the floor near the hearth. A rolled coat for a pillow, a wool blanket on top. Eva watched him work. Then she said, "Where do I sleep?" Silas pulled the blanket back and smoothed it flat. "Right here," he said. "I will take the porch." She started to protest. He cut her off, not unkindly. "The fire will keep this room warm through the night. There is more wood stacked by the door if it gets low. Coffee in the pot on the stove if you want to heat it up. Help yourself to whatever you need." He was at the door before she found her voice. "Mr. Boon." "Silas." He stopped. She was standing by the fire, backlit by the flames, and for just a moment she looked like a painting of something sacred. A woman in firelight, the oldest image in the world. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "No need." He went outside, closed the door softly behind him, sat down on the porch with his back against the cabin wall, and wrapped a thin blanket around his shoulders, and stared out at the dark where two wooden crosses stood like sentinels in the frozen grass. The cold was immediate and savage. It cut through the blanket and his coat, and settled into his bones with the efficient cruelty of a thing that had been doing this work for millennia. He did not care. He had endured worse. Good. The winter he buried Rebecca, he had slept on the frozen ground next to her grave for 3 nights before Joe Wheeler rode over and physically dragged him inside. He could hear Eva moving inside the cabin, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of her settling onto the blanket. And then, after a while, silence. He whispered into the dark, facing the 2 crosses he could barely see. "I am not replacing you. I just could not let another one die because I did nothing." The wind answered him with nothing. Rebecca had been dead for 2 years and 5 months, and she had never answered him once in all that time. He kept talking to her anyway because the alternative was admitting she could not hear. And he was not ready for that. From inside the cabin, he heard crying, small and choked and muffled, the sound of someone who had forgotten how to cry out loud, who had been holding it in so long that when it finally came out, it came in little broken pieces instead of one clean release. Silas closed his eyes and endured it because it was the most familiar sound he knew. He had made that exact same sound alone in this cabin for months after Rebecca died. The sound of grief compressed into something small enough to survive. He sat on the porch in the freezing dark and listened to a stranger cry. And he did not go to her, and he did not look away. He just sat there, bearing witness to a pain he recognized as intimately as his own heartbeat, and waited for the silence that always came after. 3 days. 3 days in Silas Boon's cabin, and she still had not told him the real reason she could never go back to Missouri. Not the poverty, not the in-laws who hated her, but because on a boarding house kitchen floor in Kansas City, there was a blood stain she could not scrub clean. Not from the tiles, from behind her eyes. The days had fallen into a rhythm that surprised Eva with its ease. She woke at dawn to the smell of coffee, because Silas was always up before her, moving quietly around the cabin in that careful way he had, as if he was trying not to disturb the air. She would lie still for a moment listening to the sounds of a man making breakfast. The scrape of the iron skillet on the stove, the crack of eggs, the soft thump of a coffee pot set down on the counter. Then she would rise and fold her blankets, and they would eat together at the small table, not saying much, the silence between them growing more comfortable with each morning. Silas ate the way he did everything else, efficiently and without ceremony, and Eva found herself watching his hands as they held the fork, moved the cup, tore the bread. Large hands, scarred and calloused, but careful, always careful. After breakfast, they worked. There was always work on a ranch, even a small one. Eva fed the chickens while Silas tended the horses. She hauled water from the creek while he chopped wood. She swept the cabin floor while he mended a section of fence that the wind had pushed over in the night. The labor was physical and immediate, and Eva threw herself into it with a hunger that surprised her. Because the work kept her hands busy, And when her hands were busy, her mind did not drift back to the kitchen floor in Kansas City. But the memories came anyway, swimming up through the surface of the present like fish rising from dark water. They came in fragments, shards of a mirror that had broken and could not be put back together. Her mother-in-law's hand flat against Eva's chest, pushing her backward through the doorway of the house where Thomas had grown up. My son died because of you. If you had not pushed him to take that mining job, if you had been content with what you had, he would still be alive, and you know it. The doctor in Kansas City, a tired man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, saying words that did not make sense. You have miscarried, Mrs. Merritt? Likely from stress. The shock of your husband's death combined with the physical strain of travel. You need rest, you need care. But rest cost money, and care required someone to provide it, and Eva had neither. So she had lain on the boarding house kitchen floor alone, 3 o'clock in the morning, blood soaking through her skirt and pooling on the cold tiles, and thought, Thomas, you took everything, even the child you never knew existed. She had cleaned up the blood herself, scrubbed the tiles with lye soap and cold water until her hands were raw. The landlady never knew. No one ever knew. Eva carried that secret the way soldiers carry shrapnel, embedded so deep it was easier to leave it in than try to dig it out. Now she stood in Silas Boon's cabin, kneading bread dough on his rough-hewn counter, and she pushed the memories down the way she always did. Pushed them under the surface and held them there with the weight of her hands working the dough, pressing and folding and pressing again, turning grief into something useful, something that would rise and become bread and feed a man who had been living on beans and salt pork, as if he was punishing himself for being alive, because that was what Silas was doing. Eva had figured that out on the first day. The cabin had ingredients, flour and sugar and salt and dried beef and potatoes in the cellar and eggs from the chickens. But Silas cooked the same thing every meal: beans, salt pork, coffee, as if variety was a pleasure he did not deserve. On the third afternoon, while Silas was out checking the cattle in the north pasture, Eva opened the wooden chest near the bed looking for extra blankets. She found the baby shoes first. 2 pairs, tiny, unworn. One pair was knitted from soft yellow yarn. The other was cut from leather so small it could have fit in Eva's palm. They had never been put on a child's feet. They had been made with love and hope, and then placed in a dark chest because the child they were meant for never arrived. Eva held them in her hands and her heart stopped. She understood instantly. She understood the way only a woman who has lost a child can understand. These shoes told the whole story. Someone had been expecting a baby. Someone had prepared. Someone had dreamed of tiny feet filling these tiny shoes. And then the baby had not come, or had come and not stayed, and the shoes went into the dark. She placed them back carefully, exactly as she had found them. Then she saw the letter. It was folded beneath the shoes. A woman's handwriting, small and neat. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear. Eva unfolded it just enough to read the first line. Dear Catherine, I am frightened of him. Her blood went cold. She did not read more. She folded the letter back, placed it beneath the baby shoes, and closed the chest. Her hands were shaking. Her mind was racing. I am frightened of him. Written by a woman, in this cabin. About the man whose roof Eva was sleeping under. The man she had followed into the wilderness, on nothing more than the evidence of gentle hands and quiet words. Rebecca, the dead wife. The woman buried behind the cabin in one of those 2 graves Eva had not yet gone to look at. Rebecca had been frightened of Silas Boon. Frightened enough to write a letter about it to someone named Catherine. Eva stood in the middle of the cabin and forced herself to breathe. She looked at the door, and the old instinct rose in her. The instinct that said, run. The instinct that had gotten her out of Missouri and onto a stagecoach heading west. The instinct that said, when things got dangerous, the smart move was to leave. But she had nowhere to go. And 17 cents would not take her anywhere. And besides, there was something in the careful way Silas moved through the world, the way he had taken the porch instead of the warm room, the way he handled the horses and the eggs and the rifle when the wolf appeared, steady, controlled, deliberately gentle, as if gentleness was a skill he had worked hard to learn. A man who was dangerous would not have slept on the freezing porch so a stranger could feel safe. Would he? She pushed the question down with all the others and went back to her bread dough. That evening she nailed the stew. Dried beef and potatoes and onions and the last of the carrots she had found in the cellar, simmered for hours until the meat fell apart, and the broth was thick and rich. When Silas came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the porch and hanging his coat by the door, the cabin smelled like a home for the first time in what Eva guessed was a very long while. He sat at the table. She set the bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon and took the first bite, and then he stopped, his eyes closed. Not like a man savoring food. Like a man absorbing pain. As though the taste of something cooked with care was a wound he had not expected. He ate slowly, deliberately, and when the bowl was empty, he sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table, not looking at her. "That was real good," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Thank you." They talked that evening, still carefully, still keeping distance between the words. But the silences grew shorter, and the sentences grew longer, and Eva found herself almost smiling once or twice at the dry way Silas described his more difficult cattle. Then she was at the dry sink, washing the dishes, and the knife slipped. It was nothing. A small cut on her index finger. The blade nicked the skin just below the nail, and a thin line of blood welled up and dropped into the basin of water. 1 drop, 2. Eva froze. Not from the pain, from the color, red in water, spreading, thinning, the way blood looks when it swirls through clean liquid, becoming something almost beautiful before it becomes something horrible. She was back on the kitchen floor. She was on her back, on cold tiles, and there was blood between her thighs. And she was alone, and the child inside her was dying, and there was nothing she could do. Nothing she could do. Nothing. She did not move. Could not. Her hand was under the water, and the blood was still coming, and she was not in Wyoming anymore. She was in Kansas City on a kitchen floor at 3 in the morning, and the world had taken everything from her, and she could not breathe. Silas appeared beside her. She had not heard him move. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand an explanation. He simply took a clean cloth from the counter, lifted her hand out of the water, and wrapped the cut finger in the fabric. Then he held her hand in both of his. His grip was warm and steady. His scarred hands closed around her smaller ones and held them like something fragile and precious. He stood there saying nothing, while Eva shook and could not stop shaking. Slowly, by degrees, the trembling eased. The kitchen floor in Kansas City receded. The present reasserted itself. She was here. In Silas Boon's cabin. In Wyoming. She was alive. She was safe. He let go of her hands, stepped back, gave her space. And Eva said something she had not planned to say. Something she had not told anyone, not the doctor, not her mother-in-law, not the landlady, not a single soul on this earth. "I was pregnant once." 3 words. Then silence. Silas Boon stood there in his cabin that smelled of stew and wood smoke and looked at Eva Merritt with an expression she had not expected. Not pity, not shock, not the hollow sympathy she had braced herself for. Recognition. As though he was hearing his own story told back to him in someone else's voice. He did not ask what happened. She did not explain. But something shifted between them in that moment. Some wall that had been standing, holding them apart, developed a crack. Not a collapse, just a fissure. Just enough to let the light through. And in the chest across the room, beneath 2 pairs of unworn baby shoes, a dead woman's letter waited like a lit fuse. The next morning, Eva went behind the cabin looking for the well and found 2 crosses instead. She stood there in the early frost, her breath making small white clouds in the air. and read the names carved into weathered wood. The tall cross said, Rebecca Boon, born 1842, died 1871. The light of my life. The small cross said, Baby Boon, 1871, never drew breath. Eva stood between the two graves and understood that the man who had given her shelter was living inside his own graveyard. She did not go inside to ask him about it. She did not demand an explanation or an account or a history. Instead, she knelt down in the frozen grass and began pulling weeds from around the crosses. The earth was hard and cold, and the weeds came up reluctantly, clinging to the soil with stubborn roots, and Eva pulled them one by one, working slowly and carefully around the wooden markers. When Silas found her 30 minutes later, she was on her knees beside his dead wife's grave, her fingers raw and dirty, a small pile of uprooted weeds beside her. She did not look up when she heard his boots in the grass. She just kept working. He stood there for a long time. She could feel him watching her the way you feel the sun on your back, even when you cannot see it. Then he sat down, not beside her, a few feet away, cross-legged in the frozen grass, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the two crosses. He was quiet for so long that Eva finished clearing the weeds around Rebecca's grave and started on the babies. She died in childbirth, Silas said. His voice was flat. Not emotionless, the opposite. So full of emotion that he had compressed it down to something dense and hard and controlled. The way you compress gunpowder into a cartridge. Every word was measured. Every syllable held in check. We had been out here 2 years. Built this cabin with our own hands. Every log, every nail. She was strong, strongest person I ever knew. And when the baby started coming, she was not scared. She said women had been doing this since the beginning of time, and she was not going to be the one who could not manage it. He stopped, picked up a piece of dried grass and turned it over in his fingers. The labor went wrong. I do not know how. I am not a doctor. There was blood, too much blood. The baby came out wrong, not breathing. I tried everything I knew, which was nothing. I held that baby in my arms for 2 hours before I could make myself believe it was real, that she was gone. They were both gone. He said it the way a soldier gives a battlefield report, clinical, stripped of everything but fact, because that was the only way he could say it without shattering. I dug the graves the next morning. Ground was frozen. Took me all day with a pickaxe. Joe Wheeler came over and tried to help, but I would not let her. Had to do it myself. Felt like if I did not dig those graves with my own hands, then maybe it was not real. Maybe if someone else did it, I could pretend it was not happening. Eva stopped pulling weeds. She sat back on her heels and looked at Silas Boon, this man made of scars and silence. And she saw the thing he had been hiding behind all that quiet. Not strength, grief. A grief so big it had eaten everything else and left only the shell. I know, she said. And then she told him. She told him about the kitchen floor in Kansas City, about the blood and the loneliness and the 3 o'clock darkness and the child she never got to name. She told him about the doctor's clinical words and the landlady who never noticed and the stagecoach heading west, and the way she had carried this secret like a stone in her chest for 8 months because there was nobody alive she trusted enough to give it to. They sat on cold grass beside 2 graves and shared the same hell in different versions. I think that is why I was not afraid when I followed you that night, Eva said. Not because I trusted you, because I had stopped being afraid of dying. Something moved behind Silas's eyes. Something that had been frozen solid for a long time, shifting and cracking, the way ice breaks on a creek when spring finally comes. He looked at Eva, and she saw the exact moment when his reason for caring about her changed. It was no longer guilt, no longer obligation. It was something else, something he did not yet have a name for, something that frightened him more than anything else in the world. They went into town that afternoon to check on the stagecoach. The blacksmith, a thick-armed man named Garrett, with permanently soot-stained hands, delivered the news without ceremony. 10 more days, minimum, Had to send to Denver for parts. Could be longer. Eva heard the words and waited for the panic that should have followed. The desperation. The fear. But it did not come. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Something confusing and unexpected and impossible to name. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her. And they both knew that 10 more days was not a sentence. It was something else entirely. At the general store, Eva felt the eyes before she saw the woman. A prickling on the back of her neck. The sense of being watched by something patient and predatory. She turned and saw Delilah Thorne for the first time. The mayor's wife was a handsome woman in her 50s. Expensive fabric. Gray hair perfectly arranged. A face that might have been kind once but had been trained into something harder. Her eyes traveled from Eva to Silas and back again, and she smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of a cat watching a mouse walk into the open. Eva felt danger. She did not understand it yet, but she felt it the way animals feel a storm coming in the blood and the bone. They did not speak. Delilah simply looked and smiled, and turned away to resume her shopping as if Eva was of no more consequence than a fly on the windowsill. On the ride home, Silas was quiet longer than usual. The wagon creaked, and the horses plodded, and the prairie stretched out endless on all sides, and neither of them spoke until they were halfway back to the cabin. Then Silas said, "Mrs. Thorne noticed you." "I know," Eva said. "No, you do not understand." He pulled the reins tighter. In Willow Junction, Delilah Thorne does not just notice people, she chooses them. And when Delilah Thorne chooses someone, that person does not get peace again. The words hung in the air between them, and Eva thought about the letter in the chest, and the 2 graves behind the cabin, and the way the wolf had stood in the road and stared and then vanished into the grass. And she wondered how many kinds of danger a person could face in a single lifetime. That night, alone in the cabin while Silas sat on the porch in the cold, Eva lay awake and thought about the letter. "I am frightened of him." Rebecca's words, written by the woman in the grave, the woman whose baby shoes sat in a chest not 10 feet from where Eva lay. The woman Silas had described with a grief so deep it had no bottom. A man who grieved that deeply for his wife was not likely to be the kind of man who hurt her. But the letter existed, and the words were clear. And Eva knew better than most people that love and fear were not mutually exclusive, that you could love someone and be afraid of them at the same time, that the most dangerous men were sometimes the ones who loved the most. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and made no decisions. But a seed of doubt was planted now, and it changed the way she held herself around him. Slightly more watchful, slightly less relaxed. A step further from the door. An ear tuned to sounds she had not been listening for before. She would not confront him, not yet. But she would watch. And she would wait. And if she needed to run, she would know the way. The second week began with 3 dead cattle. Throats cut clean and professional. Not wolves, not bears. A knife. Someone who knew exactly where to place the blade. Silas found them in the north pasture at first light. 3 cows lying in the frozen grass with their blood turning the frost pink. He stood over them for a long time, reading the ground the way a man reads a letter. Boot prints, hoof marks, the angle of the cuts. Eva watched from the fence line and saw his face go still and hard, the way a lake freezes over, surface smooth and cold while everything underneath goes dark. He did not rage, did not shout, did not curse or threaten or swing his fist at the air. He just stood there and calculated. $90, he said when he came back to the cabin. That is what those 3 head were worth. 1/3 of what I would make this year. Someone wants me off this land, or wants me poor enough that I have to sell. Who? Eva asked. Silas shook his head. Could be anyone. Could be the Thorns looking to expand their holdings. Could be someone who does not like me. Could be someone who does not like you being here. The words landed in Eva's chest like stones dropped into still water. Joe Wheeler arrived that afternoon as if summoned by some sixth sense that told her when trouble had come to Silas Boon's doorstep. She rode in on a buckskin mare, a shotgun across her saddle and a pot of stew hanging from the horn. Joe Wheeler was 55 years old, built like a fence post wrapped in rawhide, with dark skin weathered by decades of prairie sun and wind. She had been born into slavery in Georgia, freed by the war, and had come west with her husband Samuel Wheeler in 1866. They had built a ranch together from nothing. Samuel had died of fever in 70, and Joe had kept the ranch going alone ever since. She was the one who had stitched Silas's face when he first came west. Not a horse accident scar like people assumed, a bayonet wound from Shiloh that had not healed right. Joe had seen enough war wounds to recognize one, and she had sewn him up without asking questions because out here, questions were a luxury that could get people killed. She looked at Eva with sharp, appraising eyes and said, "So this is the girl the whole town is buzzing about." "I thought you would be taller the way they tell it." Eva liked her immediately. While Silas rode out to check the rest of his herd, Joe took Eva somewhere. They saddled 2 horses and rode east for about a mile until they came to a plot of empty land near the creek. Weeds grew through a cracked stone foundation. A rusted stovepipe lay on its side in the grass. A chimney stood alone, connected to nothing, like a finger pointing at the sky. "Family named Sullivan ran a laundry here," Joe said. She sat her horse and looked at the ruins with an expression that was neither sad nor angry, but something older than both. "Came here from County Cork in Ireland. Husband, wife, 2 children. The little one was born right there where that stovepipe is." She paused. Let the wind fill the silence. Delilah Thorne decided they lowered the tone of the town. 6 months later, their barn burned. Then their well was poisoned. Then the sheriff told them it might be healthier to move along. They left for California with nothing but the clothes on their backs and 2 little children who did not understand why they had to leave their home. Joe looked at Eva. Her eyes were steady and hard. There was a freedman before them, bought land near town, wanted to farm. Delilah Thorne told her husband, the mayor, that property values would suffer. The man's cattle were poisoned, his fences cut, his well filled with dead animals. He left inside a month. And a widow from Ireland who sold whiskey, and another family who ran a laundry on Main Street. All gone, all driven out, all by the quiet machinery of Delilah Thorne. "I survive because I live far enough away that she does not bother with me," Joe said. "But you are right there under her nose, living with a man she considers strange and dangerous, defying every rule she has built her life around. You are not the first person she has targeted, you are just the latest." Eva looked at the ruined foundation, and the rusted stovepipe and the chimney standing alone, and she thought about the people who had built something here and lost it. Not to fire or flood or the simple cruelty of the land, but to the cruelty of a woman who could not tolerate anything that challenged her idea of how the world should be. "I am not going to run," Eva said. She was surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I have been running for 8 months and I am done." "Good," Joe said. "Then we need to make sure you can protect yourself." That evening, Silas taught Eva to shoot. He set up tin cans on the fence rail behind the barn and showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. He stood behind her with his hands on her arms, adjusting her stance, and they were closer than they had ever been. And Eva could feel the heat of his body through his coat and smell leather and grass and wood smoke, and neither of them said a word about any of it. She missed the first shot by 2 feet, the second by 6 inches. The third shot hit the can dead center and sent it spinning off the rail. "Good," Silas said. "1 word." But the way he said it, like he was slightly less afraid for her than he had been a moment ago, told Eva everything she needed to know. He was not teaching her to shoot for fun. He was preparing her for the possibility that he might not be there when she needed protecting. Later that night, after Eva was asleep, Silas sat in the barn alone. He had kept the bottle of whiskey for 2 years. It sat on a shelf behind the horse tack, gathering dust, untouched since the night he had decided to stop drinking. The night Joe Wheeler had found him passed out in the snow behind the cabin, half dead from cold and liquor, and had slapped him across the face hard enough to draw blood and said, "You can die if you want to, but you are going to do it sober so you know exactly what you are throwing away." He had not touched it since. 2 years, 700 and some days, but now 3 cows lay dead in his pasture, and someone was trying to destroy him, and he could feel the old thing stirring inside him. The thing that Shiloh had planted, and 3 years of solitary grief had fed. The rage, the need to break something, the violence that lived in his bones like a dormant fever, waiting for the moment when his defenses dropped. He uncorked the bottle, drank. The whiskey burned going down and hit his stomach like a fist, and he drank again, and then he stood up and put his fist through the barn wall. The pain was immediate and clarifying. The skin over his knuckles split open and blood ran down his fingers, and he stared at his hand in the lamplight and thought, "There you are. There is the man Rebecca was afraid of. There is the man who came home from the war with something broken inside him that he could not fix." The barn door creaked open. Eva stood there in her coat, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with something that was not quite fear but was close enough. She did not run. But she stayed in the doorway. She did not come closer. "Are you going to tell me what that letter meant?" she said. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. "You read it," he said. "Only the first line. I am frightened of him. That is all I needed." Silence. The wind pushed against the barn walls. The horses shifted in their stalls. Blood dripped from Silas's knuckles onto the straw. Then he sat down, right there in the straw, back against the wall, and he told her the truth. Shiloh. The battle that lasted 2 days in April of '62. The sounds he could still hear 12 years later. The bayonet that had opened his face from ear to jaw. The field hospital where they had sewed him up without anesthetic because there was none left. The months of recovery. The nightmares that came after. And what the nightmares did to him. "I came home from the war and I was a monster," he said. "Not right away. It happened slow, like a fever building. The dreams came first, then the anger, then the need to break things. I smashed chairs, punched walls, threw a table through a window. Rebecca would find me in the middle of the night standing in the yard, screaming at nothing. He looked at his bleeding hand. She was right to be afraid. I never touched her. Not once. I swear that on everything I have left. But she lived with a man she could not predict, and that is its own kind of violence. She never knew if the man who sat across from her at breakfast was going to be the man she married, or the man who came home from Shiloh. And that uncertainty, that constant waiting for the other boot to drop, that ate her alive. He looked up at Eva, standing in the doorway with the cold wind at her back. She wrote that letter to her sister Catherine. Never sent it. I found it after she died. Read it once. Should have burned it. Could not make myself. Felt like if I burned it, I was pretending it never happened. And it happened. Eva stood there processing. Every instinct she had, the instinct that had carried her out of Missouri and onto a stagecoach in 1,200 miles west, screamed at her to leave. This man was dangerous once. His dead wife said so in her own handwriting. This was the moment to run. This was the moment that survival instinct was made for. But Eva looked at his bleeding hand, saw the knuckles split from hitting a wall instead of a person, saw the whiskey bottle on its side in the straw, most of the liquid still inside because he had stopped himself before it was empty. Saw the truth in his eyes, offered freely when a lie would have been so much easier. I spent 5 years becoming someone she deserved, he said. I quit drinking. I learned to breathe through the nightmares. I taught myself to be still when the rage came instead of letting it loose. I became the man I should have been from the start. But by the time I made it, she was in the ground. His voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough. I am not going to live with a man who destroys himself, Eva said quietly. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. If you want me here, you choose to live, not just exist. Choose it. Silas looked up at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at his cabin, she saw him afraid. Not of enemies or wolves or losing cattle. Afraid of being seen completely, all the way down to the ugly parts, and still being chosen. I will choose it, he said. I will try. Eva nodded once. Then she went back to the cabin and lay awake until she heard him come in from the barn and settle onto the porch for the night. At some point in those dark hours, she got up, found the whiskey bottle where he had left it, and walked down to the creek and poured it out. The liquor disappeared into the cold black water without a sound. She did not tell him she had done it. He did not ask. But the next morning, when he went to the barn and saw the bottle gone, he looked at her across the breakfast table, and something passed between them that did not need words. That night, Eva lay awake listening to Silas turning on the hard porch in the freezing cold. The temperature had dropped below zero. She could hear the wind screaming around the cabin walls like an animal trying to get inside. He was freezing out there for her every night, so she could feel safe. She got up and opened the door. He was sitting with his back against the wall, blanket around his shoulders, face red with cold. "Come inside," she said. "It is too cold." He looked up at her, and in the firelight spilling through the doorway, the scar on his face looked like a map of a country she was beginning to want to stay in. Silas saw the dust on the horizon at 6 in the morning, someone riding in hard from the east. On the plains, nobody came calling at 6 in the morning with good news. He was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light come up over the grass, when he spotted it. A plume of dust rising against the pale sky, moving fast. One rider, coming straight toward the cabin. Eva was still asleep inside. Since the night she had told him to come in from the porch, they had settled into a new arrangement. Silas slept on the floor near the door, blankets rolled out on the boards 6 feet from where Eva lay by the fire. The same room now, not because of feelings, because of the dead cattle and the threat neither of them could name, because Silas needed to be between Eva and whatever might come through that door in the night. He had not told her why he had started sleeping inside. He suspected she knew. The coffee was hot and strong, and he drank it watching the rider approach. And he thought about the fact that he had started making coffee before Eva woke. Not because she asked him to, but because he wanted to see that moment when she opened her eyes and smelled it and smiled before she was fully awake, before the weight of the day settled onto her shoulders. That small, unguarded smile was becoming the thing he looked forward to most in the world, and he knew that was dangerous, because the last time he had loved someone, he had ended up digging graves. But Eva had told him to choose to live, and choosing meant accepting that some things were worth the risk of losing. The rider came into focus as the distance closed. A man, well-dressed even at this distance, dark hair, good horse. He rode with the confidence of someone who expected the world to accommodate him. Eva appeared in the doorway behind Silas, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Who is it?" she asked. Silas did not answer because he did not know. But something about the rider's bearing, the aggressive tilt of his body in the saddle, the straight line of his approach, made the hair on Silas's arms stand up. The man dismounted in the yard, and Eva made a sound behind Silas that was half gasp and half something else, something older and more complicated than surprise. "Marcus," she said. Marcus Hale was 35 years old, tall and well-built, with dark hair graying at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if it had not been arranged into an expression of barely controlled fury. He tied his horse to the porch rail and looked at Eva with eyes that held equal parts anger and grief. "Eva, thank God. I have been searching for you for weeks." Eva stepped out from behind Silas, and Silas noticed that she positioned herself beside him, not behind him, standing her own ground. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" Marcus looked from Eva to Silas and back. His eyes lingered on the cabin, on the two coffee cups, on the proximity of these two people standing on the porch together in the early morning. "Your landlady in Kansas City said you had headed west," he said. "The trail went cold after that. I hired a detective, tracked you to the stagecoach company, then to Willow Junction, then here." He said the word here the way a man says a curse word, with disgust barely contained. "What I've found is my brother's widow living alone with a strange man in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. What exactly am I supposed to think about that?" "You are not supposed to think anything," Eva said. Her voice was careful and controlled. "Mr. Boon offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. That is all." Marcus ignored this. He turned to Silas. "Can we talk?" "Inside." "No," Silas said. "We can talk right here." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. And then he did something Silas had not expected. He took a breath and his expression changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine pain. "Ava," he said, and his voice was different now, softer, cracked at the edges. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me." Eva waited. "Thomas took that mining job because I recommended it. I told him the money was good. I told him it was safe. I told him he would be a fool to pass it up." Marcus's eyes were bright with moisture. "He died in that mine because of me, because I pushed him into it. And I have lived with that every single day since." He looked at his hands. "I came out here because I owe him. I owe you. You are his wife, his widow. And I promised myself that whatever happened, I would make sure you were taken care of. That is all I want, just to make sure you are safe." Eva stood still. Silas could see the war on her face. The part of her that wanted to believe this man was sincere, fighting against the part that remembered being thrown out of her mother-in-law's house, blamed for Thomas's death, told she was not welcome in the family or the town or anywhere near the memories of the man she had loved. Then Marcus said the thing that changed everything. "Eva, there is something else. About your cousin Martha in Silver Creek." He paused. She passed. "Consumption. About 18 months ago. There is nobody there. There is nothing waiting for you in Silver Creek." The words hit Eva like a physical blow. Silas saw her sway, saw the color leave her face, saw the moment when the last shred of her plan, the thing she had been holding on to across 1,200 miles of desperate travel, evaporated like mist in morning sun. Martha was dead. Silver Creek was a dead end. There was nowhere to go. Eva turned without a word and walked off the porch into the yard, heading out toward the open prairie. Not running. Walking. But walking fast. Like someone trying to outpace something that could not be outpaced. Silas started to follow. Marcus moved to block him. "Let her go. She needs time." "She does not need time," Silas said. "She needs to not be alone." He stepped around Marcus and followed Eva into the grass. He caught up to her about 50 yards from the cabin and fell into step beside her. He did not speak, did not touch her, just walked beside her while the wind bent the prairie grass and the sky stretched enormous and empty above them. They walked for a while. Then Eva stopped. "I have nowhere to go," she said. Her voice was small and flat and stripped of everything. Silas stood beside her in the wind and said the truest thing he had ever said. "You have here." 2 words. But they landed in the silence between them with the weight of something permanent. Back at the cabin, Marcus watched them through the window. The woman he had tracked across half the country, standing in the grass with a scarred stranger, and the way she turned toward him instead of away. Marcus saw the moment he began losing, and it was not Eva he was losing to. It was Silas Boon, the man who had done nothing more than stand beside her in the wind and say 2 words. Marcus left that afternoon. Polite, controlled. But as he mounted his horse, he leaned down and spoke to Silas in a voice too low for Eva to hear. "She is my family, Boon. Blood. You are just a stranger who gave her a floor to sleep on. Do not confuse kindness with a claim." Silas said nothing, but his jaw was tight as iron. That evening, after supper, Eva and Silas sat on the porch. She mended one of his shirts, pulling thread through the frayed cuff with steady fingers. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the space between them. The sun set. The sky turned from blue to gold, to deep amber to purple. The wind settled to a whisper. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket started up and then another, until the whole prairie hummed with small, persistent life. For 200 words, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence was not empty. It was full of the scrape of stone and the pull of thread, and the settling of two people into each other's presence, like water finding its level. This was the scene that said everything the story needed to say about love, without once using the word. Two people, side by side, doing small, quiet things in the fading light. Not because they had to, because there was nowhere else they wanted to be. That night, for the first time, Silas slept inside the cabin. On the floor, 6 feet from Eva, but in the same room. Not because of feelings, because of the way Marcus had looked at the cabin as he rode away. Like a man measuring a building before he tears it down. Silas lay in the dark, listening to Eva breathe, slow and steady. The sound of someone who felt safe enough to sleep deeply. He thought, the last time I tried to protect someone I loved, I failed. This time has to be different. Then he realized he had used the word loved, and that was when he knew he had fallen too far to climb back out. The fire started at 3 in the morning, and by the time Eva smelled smoke, the barn was a pillar of flame. She woke to the smell before the sound. Smoke, thick and acrid, seeping through the cabin walls. Then the crackling, not the gentle pop of their hearth fire, but a deeper, hungrier sound, like something enormous eating its way through solid wood. Silas was already on his feet. He was out the door before Eva could form a word, and then she was at the window, and what she saw turned her blood to ice. The barn was fully engulfed. Flames climbed the walls and poured from the loft opening and lit the night sky orange. She could hear the horses screaming inside. Eva ran outside. Silas was at the barn doors, wrestling with the latch. The heat was enormous, pushing at her like a solid wall even from 30 feet away. She could see the sweat on his face already turning to steam. He got the doors open and plunged inside. Eva heard the horses scream again, and then saw them burst out into the night, eyes rolling white with terror, manes singed, hooves throwing up clods of frozen earth as they bolted for the corral. Then Silas came out, stumbling. His hands were black and blistered. He had grabbed the burning door with his bare hands to wrench it off its hinges. Behind him, the barn collapsed inward with a sound like the world ending. Sparks exploded upward in a column that lit the prairie for half a mile. Eva ran to him. He was bent over, coughing, his hands held out in front of him like they belonged to someone else. The skin from his wrist to his fingertips was raw and weeping. They stood in the yard and watched the barn burn to nothing. Everything inside was gone. Winter feed stores, tools, tack, saddles, a year's worth of supplies laid in against the cold. All of it turning to ash and smoke and floating upward into the dark Wyoming sky. The smell of kerosene was unmistakable. This was not an accident. This was arson. Someone had soaked the barn walls in fuel and set them alight while Eva and Silas slept. Eva got him inside the cabin and sat him down at the table. She heated water and tore a clean shirt into strips and began cleaning his burns. The skin was angry red and already blistering, the worst of it on his palms where he had gripped the burning wood. He sat rigid, jaw clenched while she worked. "You are not allowed to die," she said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady, was not planning on it. "Promise me." He looked at her. His eyes were dark with pain and fury, and something else she had not seen before. Something like tenderness forced through a filter of agony. "I promise." She wrapped his hands in the torn cloth, layer by careful layer. And when she tied the last knot, her fingers lingered on his wrists for a moment longer than necessary, and they both felt it, and neither of them pulled away. Joe Wheeler arrived before dawn, riding hard through the dark with 2 men behind her. Hank and Isaac, former soldiers who worked her ranch, men who had seen worse than a burned barn and did not spook easy. They brought lumber and tools in a wagon full of supplies. Joe took one look at the smoking ruins and one look at Silas's bandaged hands and said, "We rebuild, but this time we post a watch." Eva did not wait for the sun to come up. She saddled one of Silas's horses, a mare that had escaped the fire with nothing worse than singed whiskers, and rode into town. She arrived at the church during Sunday morning service. The entire town was there, filling the pews, heads bowed in prayer or pretending to be. Eva walked up the center aisle with dirt on her face and smoke on her clothes, and the cold fury of a woman who had been pushed too far too many times. The congregation stared. Reverend Mills stopped mid-sentence. Eva stood at the front of the church and faced them all. She found Delilah Thorne in the second row, dressed in black silk with a pearl brooch at her throat, looking at Eva with an expression of cultivated disbelief. "Someone burned our barn last night," Eva said. Her voice carried clear and calm to every corner of the small building. "I have no proof who did it, but I want every person in this church to know something. If my husband or I come to harm, the name Marcus Hale, and anyone who aided him will be the first the law hears." She called Silas my husband. They were not married. No one corrected her. The silence in the church was absolute. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, looked at her husband. The blacksmith shifted in his pew. Two ranchers from the north pasture land exchanged a glance. The town was splitting. Eva could feel it happening in real time, like watching a crack run through ice. Some people were shifting toward her side, not out of love or friendship, but out of something older and more practical. The recognition that what was happening to Eva and Silas could happen to any of them. Others stayed frozen in their seats, eyes forward, unwilling to meet Eva's gaze. These were the ones who feared Delilah Thorne more than they feared their own consciences. Eva walked out of the church without waiting for a response. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Silas came to her while she was feeding the chickens and said the things she had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. "We should get married." Eva's hands stilled on the grain bucket. "If we are legally married," he said, his voice practical and flat, "you are protected by territorial law. My land becomes your land. My property is your property. If something happens to me, you keep everything. Marcus Hale cannot touch you." Eva stood there with chicken feed in her hands and felt two things at once. The first was a rush of warmth so intense it made her dizzy. The second was anger. "That is not a reason to get married," she said. "It is a good reason to get married now, the real reason. No." She set the bucket down. She turned to face him. She looked at his bandaged hands and his smoke-stained face and the scar that ran like a river across his jaw. And she said, "I married Thomas for love. If this is not that, I would rather face Marcus alone." Silas blinked. Then he was quiet for a long time. The wind blew. The chickens clucked and pecked at the ground. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in slow, patient spirals. Eva had forced him into a corner, and she knew it. She was asking for the one thing that was harder for Silas Boon than fighting or working or enduring pain. She was asking him to be vulnerable. The silence stretched. Eva began to wonder if she had pushed too far. Then Silas spoke. "It is not about the law," he said. His voice was rough and halting, like a man trying to speak a language he had not used in years. "It is about the fact that you are the first reason I have had to wake up in the morning in 3 years. And I am terrified that if I say that out loud, I will lose you the way I lost her." Eva felt her eyes burn. "Say it anyway," she said. Another silence. Then, "I love you, Eva, and it scares me half to death." "Good," Eva said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Now ask me again." He looked at her with those creek-water eyes, standing in the yard of a half-burned homestead with bandaged hands and nothing to offer except scarred land and a scarred heart, and he said, "Will you marry me? Not for the law. For real." "Yes," Eva said, "but not for the law. Because I choose you, Silas Boon. I choose you." They married on Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, her husband was in handcuffs being led away on horseback, and Eva stood watching him go with the taste of blood in her mouth from biting her lip to keep from screaming. The wedding was small and quiet. Half-empty church. Reverend Mills presiding, wearing a clean collar and an expression of genuine warmth. Joe Wheeler standing to one side as witness, dressed in her best coat with her shotgun leaning against the pew because Joe Wheeler did not go anywhere without her shotgun. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson from the general store standing on the other side, looking pleased and slightly nervous. Eva wore a calico dress she had altered from fabric she found in the cabin. Rebecca's fabric. She had hesitated before cutting into it, knowing whose hands had chosen the pattern, whose needle had first touched the cloth. But she also knew that fabric was meant to be worn, not folded in a dark chest forever. Silas wore his best shirt, mended by Eva's hand. The cuffs she had fixed, the collar she had straightened, the missing button she had replaced. When the Reverend asked, "Do you take this woman?" Silas said yes before the question was finished. Eva laughed. A real laugh. The first one in nearly a year. The sound surprised both of them. It rang through the half-empty church like a bell, and Silas looked at her with an expression of wonder, as if he had forgotten that laughter was something that existed in the world. They kissed at the altar, and Eva felt something shift inside her. Something that had been dislocated for a long time, finally clicking back into place. Reverend Mills smiled. Mr. Patterson shook Silas's hand. Mrs. Patterson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Joe Wheeler picked up her shotgun and said, "About damn time." They walked out of the church into the afternoon sunlight, and Eva thought, "This is real. This is my life now. This is the thing I chose." They made it 3 steps. Sheriff Dugan was waiting on the church steps with a warrant in his hand and an expression that said he would rather be anywhere else on earth. "Silas Boon," he said, "I have a warrant here for your arrest. Cattle rustling. 6 head of Circle H branded cattle found on your property." Behind Dugan, Eva saw the faces. Marcus Hale standing with a group of men. Mayor Thorne. Several ranchers who looked uncomfortable but resolute. And a young man Eva did not recognize, thin and weathered, who would not meet anyone's eyes. Silas did not resist. He looked at Eva and said, "Do not cry in front of them. Do not let them see you scared." Eva swallowed her tears. Nodded. Watched them put handcuffs on her husband's wrists, still bandaged from the burns. Watched them lead him to a horse. Watched him ride away surrounded by men who believed, or claimed to believe, that he was a criminal. Marcus Hale rode past her close enough to touch. "You should have come with me when you had the chance," he said. His face was a mask of satisfaction poorly disguised as concern. Eva watched him go and felt something harden inside her, something cold and sharp and clear as glass. Then she went to work. Day 1. She went to Reverend Mills. The old pastor sat in his study with a pot of coffee and a Bible, and the quiet, steady presence of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and decided to believe in the best anyway. "I know what they did," Eva said. "They planted those cattle, Marcus and the Thorns. They framed him." Reverend Mills nodded slowly. "I believe you. But believing and proving are 2 different things." Then he told her something she had not expected. Before he found God, Reverend Mills had been a gunfighter, rode with a bad outfit in the Kansas Territory, killed men for reasons that stopped making sense decades ago. He knew how violent men thought because he had been one. "I know how men like Marcus operate," he said. "We do not need evidence. We need someone on their side to break." Day 2. Eva found Emily Thorne. The mayor's daughter was coming out of the dressmaker's shop on Main Street when Eva stepped into her path. Emily's face went pale. "Mrs. Boon," she said, "I cannot talk to you. If my mother sees us—" "Your mother is not here," Eva said, "and I am not going to waste your time with small talk. You love Miguel Reyes, the wrangler at the Dawson Ranch. You have been seeing him in secret for 6 months. Emily went white. "How did you? Joe Wheeler sees everything." Eva kept her voice low and even. "Now listen to me, Emily. Your mother has destroyed families in this town. She drove out the Sullivans. She drove out the freedmen who wanted to buy land. And now she is trying to destroy my husband for the crime of not following her rules." Emily's eyes were brimming with tears. "I do not need your courage," Eva said. "I need your selfishness. Help me, and I will help you get free of her." Emily Thorne looked at Eva Merritt Boon, standing in the middle of Main Street with smoke still in her hair and determination in her eyes and something that looked like freedom, and she began to cry. "I know things," she whispered. "I have heard things. Mother and Marcus have been meeting. I heard them talking 3 nights ago. Planning." "Tell me everything," Eva said. Day 3. Eva found Rollins in the saloon. He was sitting at a back table with a half-empty whiskey glass, and the look of a man who had sold something important and was trying not to think about the price. He was young, maybe 28, thin and weathered by wind and work, and the particular kind of poverty that grinds a man down to nothing without the courtesy of killing him outright. Eva sat across from him without asking permission. He looked up, startled. "How much did Marcus Hale pay you to lie?" she asked. Rollins flinched, looked around, looked back. "I do not know what you are talking about." $50, Eva said. "That is the going rate for a man's life, apparently. Tell me, Mr. Rollins, when they hang an innocent man on your testimony, will that $50 buy you a night's sleep?" He did not answer, but his eyes wavered. Eva leaned forward. "I am not threatening you. I am asking you to think about what you are doing. My husband never stole a head of cattle in his life. You know that. Marcus Hale knows that. Everyone in this town knows that. The only question is whether $50 is worth another man's neck." She stood up and left. Rollins sat at the table staring at his whiskey and said nothing. On her way to the jail that evening, Eva passed the church and stopped. The door was open. Inside, in the dimming light, she could see Marcus Hale sitting alone in a pew. His head was bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, and he was talking, not praying, talking, to someone who was not there. "Tommy," he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I promised you I would take care of her. That is all I wanted. To keep my word. Why will she not let me keep my word?" Eva stood in the doorway and listened, and for the first time she understood something that complicated everything. Marcus Hale did not hate her. He hated himself. He had put his brother in a mine, and his brother had died. And if he could not save his brother's widow, then he was forever the man who killed Thomas Hale. His cruelty was not born from malice. It was born from a guilt so deep it had curdled into something poisonous. He was trying to atone, and when atonement was refused, the guilt turned to rage, and the rage turned to destruction. This did not forgive what he had done. It did not excuse the lies, the frame-up, the arson. But it made it complicated in a way that simple hatred never could. Eva turned away and walked to the jail. They gave her 10 minutes. Silas was behind bars, his face bruised, his lips swollen. The other prisoners had not been kind to an accused cattle thief. "If tomorrow goes wrong," he said, "promise me you will leave." "I promise I will burn this whole town to the ground if they touch you," Eva said. Silas Boon, who had not smiled in days, looked at his wife through iron bars and smiled. The trial began at 9 o'clock in the morning in the Willow Junction town hall. By 11, everything was going wrong. By 2 in the afternoon, Eva realized she might lose her husband before the sun went down. Judge Harrison sat at the front of the room, iron-haired and sharp-eyed, with the reputation of a man who was tough but fair. The jury was 12 men, farmers and shopkeepers and ranchers, men who worked hard and followed the law and did not have much patience for cattle thieves. The prosecutor, a young lawyer named Daniels, was better than Eva had hoped. He did not just lay out facts, he painted a picture. Silas Boon, the recluse, The man with the scarred face who lived alone 8 miles from town. The man who had punched Marcus Hale in the jaw in front of witnesses. The man whose wife, married just that morning, was the only alibi he had. And the cattle, 6 head bearing the Circle H brand, found right there on his property. Daniel stood before the jury and said, "The evidence is clear, gentlemen. This man is a cattle rustler, and the law requires that he pay the penalty." Eva sat in the front row with her hands clenched so tight her fingernails drew blood from her palms. Across the room, Silas sat at the defendant's table in handcuffs, his face unreadable. But Eva could see the tension in his shoulders, could see the way he kept his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, as if he was holding himself together by force of concentration. Rawlins took the stand. The thin young drifter with the weathered face and the $50 conscience walked up to the witness chair, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then he lied. He told the jury he had seen Silas Boon driving Circle H cattle across the north pasture 3 nights before the arrest. He said he had been riding through on his way to the next town, and had stopped to water his horse at the creek, and had witnessed the whole thing. Eva's heart sank. Her conversation in the saloon had failed. The $50 had won. The defense lawyer, an older man named Garrett, who had agreed to take the case as a favor to Reverend Mills, did his best. He called Mrs. Patterson, who testified she had heard riders passing through town at midnight heading north. He called a ranch hand who had seen Marcus meeting with strangers at the saloon. He called Eva herself, who testified under oath that Silas had been beside her every night and could not possibly have moved 6 head of cattle without her knowing. The prosecutor cross-examined her with surgical precision. "You love your husband, do you not? Of course. And you would say anything to protect him." "I tell the truth to protect him," Eva said, "which is what I am doing now." But circumstantial evidence was all they had, and the jury's faces said it was not enough. Then the courtroom door opened. Emily Thorne walked in, alone, uninvited, wearing a plain dress with her hair pulled back and her face pale as paper. She walked up the center aisle of the town hall the way Eva had walked up the church aisle, with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone who has made a decision that will change everything and cannot be undone. Delilah Thorne rose from her seat in the gallery. "Emily, sit down this instant." Emily's voice shook, but it did not break. "No, Mother." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my name is Emily Thorne. I would like to testify." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Delilah Thorne sank back into her seat with a face the color of chalk. Mayor Thorne, sitting beside his wife, went very still. Emily took the stand. She told the court that she had overheard her mother and Marcus Hale planning the entire frame. She told them about the $200 in gold coins taken from her father's safe. She told them the names of the men Marcus had hired to drive the stolen cattle onto Silas's property. And she told them one thing more. "My mother ordered the barn burned," she said. And then Marcus told her about the men he had hired, how he had turned them in to a deputy in Carter County afterward to cover his tracks. He used them and threw them away. The courtroom went dead silent. Eva looked at Rawlins. His face had gone white. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He had just heard that Marcus Hale threw away the people who worked for him, turned them in, used them as tools, and then discarded them. And Rawlins was sitting in this courtroom as Marcus's star witness, the last piece of evidence holding the whole frame together. If Marcus would betray the men who burned the barn, he would betray the man who lied under oath. Rawlins raised his hand. "Your Honor, I need to say something." Judge Harrison looked at him. The courtroom held its breath. Rawlins stood. He looked at Silas sitting in cuffs at the defendant's table, and something shifted in his face. Not courage. Fear. The primal fear of a man who has just realized he is expendable. "Marcus Hale paid me $50 to testify against Silas Boon," he said. "Everything I said on the stand was a lie. I never saw Boon steal any cattle. I never saw him do anything wrong." And he paused and his voice dropped. $50 is not worth a man's neck. I am sorry. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Not guilty. Ava did not remember crossing the courtroom. She was in her seat, and then she was in Silas's arms, and he was still wearing handcuffs, but he held her anyway, pressing his face into her hair, and she was crying, and he was saying, "It is over, Eva. It is over. We won." But it was not that simple. The verdict came with costs. Emily Thorne sat alone in the courtroom while her mother walked past without a word and out the door. Not a scream, not a dramatic confrontation, just silence, which was worse. Delilah Thorne walked past her own daughter as if she did not exist, and Emily sat there with tears running down her face and nowhere to go. Ava crossed to her and took her hand. "You will stay with us," she said, "for as long as you need." Silas was freed, but his hands were bad. The burns from the fire, aggravated by days in a cold jail cell without proper care, had become infected. Joe Wheeler took one look at the swollen red skin and the angry streaks running up his wrists and said, "He needs a real doctor. If he does not get one soon, he could lose that hand." And Marcus Hale was arrested where he stood. Sheriff Dugan walked across the courtroom and put cuffs on the man who had been so sure of his victory just an hour before. Conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, arson. He would be held in the Willow Junction town jail until transferred to the territorial prison in Laramie. As they led him away, Marcus turned. His mask was gone. The anger, the control, the self-righteous certainty. All of it stripped away. And underneath was just a man who had made terrible choices trying to outrun a guilt he could never escape. "Ava," he called out. His voice broke. "I am sorry. I just wanted to make it right with Thomas. I am sorry." Ava looked at Marcus Hale and saw the real man beneath the wreckage. A man who had loved his brother and could not forgive himself for his death. A man whose attempt at atonement had twisted into something monstrous. She did not forgive him, but she understood, and understanding was its own kind of mercy. She helped Silas into the wagon. He was thinner and weaker, his hands swollen and red. She took the reins because he could not grip them. On the road home, he leaned his head against her shoulder and said, "Can you drive?" "Yes, good." Then he passed out. Eva held the reins in one hand and her husband in the other, and drove across the moonlit prairie without crying. She did not have time for tears. Spring came to Willow Junction like an apology, slow, tentative, as though the land knew it had been too hard on these two people and was trying to make amends with wildflowers. The winter between the trial and the thaw was the hardest of Eva's life, and she had lived through some hard winters. Silas nearly lost his right hand. A doctor from the next town over, summoned by Reverend Mills, saved it after 3 days of poultices and prayer and the kind of precise, patient work that separates a good doctor from a grave digger. But 2 fingers on his right hand lost sensation permanently. The nerves were dead. He could see his fingers move, but could not feel them. He dropped cups, fumbled buttons, could not grip the reins the way he used to. For a rancher, hands are everything. They are how you hold the rope and swing the hammer and steer the horse and mend the fence and do the 1,000 daily tasks that keep a homestead alive. Losing feeling in 2 fingers was not a death sentence, but it was a wound that would never fully heal. Eva did not let him sit still long enough to feel sorry for himself. She put him to work the moment the doctor cleared him. Light tasks first, feeding chickens, shelling corn, tasks that forced his damaged hand to work without demanding the grip strength he no longer had. And while Silas relearned the basic mechanics of his own body, Eva ran the ranch. She did not help him run it. She ran it, fed the cattle, mended the fences, negotiated prices with the trader who came through every 2 weeks looking to buy beef. Joe Wheeler rode over 3 times a week and taught her everything. How to read the weather by the way the grass moved. How to tell if a cow was sick by the way it held its head. how to fix a fence post that had heaved in the frost. Eva discovered she was good at this, better than good. She had spent 27 years believing she was fragile, dependent, unsuited for anything beyond the kitchen and the sewing room. The prairie taught her otherwise. The prairie did not care about propriety or social expectation. It only cared about competence. And Eva Merritt Boon, it turned out, was competent as hell. Emily Thorne lived with them through the winter. She slept on a pallet by the fire the way Eva had slept her first night in the cabin. And she learned to do things her wealthy upbringing had never prepared her for. Hauling water, chopping kindling, milking the cow Joe Wheeler had loaned them after the barn fire. The first time Emily touched a cow, she screamed loud enough to spook the chickens. Eva laughed until she cried. It was the first time the cabin had held the sound of more than one person laughing. And the sound was so foreign to those log walls that it seemed to take a moment for the room to absorb it. But winter was not all laughter. The dark nights were long and the wind never stopped, and Silas grew quieter as the weeks went on. Not angry, just withdrawn. He sat for hours staring at his damaged hand, flexing the fingers he could no longer feel, and Eva could see him sliding into a place she recognized. The place where you start to believe you are a burden. Where the voice in your head begins telling you that the people around you would be better off if you were not there. One night in deep February, Eva woke to find his side of the bed empty. She found him on the porch, sitting in the freezing dark, staring at the two crosses behind the cabin. The moonlight caught the frost on the grass and made the graves glow like something holy. She sat beside him, said nothing, waited. "Rebecca died because I was not good enough," he said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Now you are carrying everything, because I am not strong enough. Maybe I should not have." Eva took his damaged hand, held it in both of hers, felt the two numb fingers dead to the touch but alive to her. "Do not," she said, "do not finish that sentence. You are not a hero, Silas. You are my husband, and my husband is allowed to be weak." He looked at her, and in the moonlight, with the cold wind cutting through both of them, and the graves of his first family glowing in the frost, something in his face finally let go. Not the grief. The grief would never fully leave, but the guilt. The crushing certainty that he was responsible for every bad thing that had ever happened to the people he loved. He leaned into her. She held him. And for the first time in all the months she had known him, she felt him shake with something that was not rage or cold or pain. He was crying, silently, the way men cry when they have been taught that tears are weakness and have to unlearn that lie one painful drop at a time. She held him on the porch in the freezing dark and let him break, because sometimes breaking is the first step toward mending. Emily left in March. She took the stage to Denver with Miguel Reyes, the young wrangler whose quiet courage had matched her own. Eva walked her to the gate of the property on the morning she left. "Thank you," Emily said, "for showing me what a woman can be." "Go," Eva said, "and do not look back." Emily climbed into the wagon and did not look back. Eva watched until the wagon disappeared over the ridge, and then she went inside and made coffee and started the day. Spring arrived in April with a violence that surprised her. One day the prairie was brown and dead, and the next it was exploding with color. Wildflowers she did not know the names of, pushing up through the thawed earth. Green grass running like water across the flatland. The creek behind the cabin swelling with snowmelt, running high and fast and singing. Eva was hanging laundry on the line when she felt it for the first time. Not the nausea. She had been ignoring that for a week, but the certainty, the deep, wordless, bone-level knowledge that she was pregnant. She stood in the spring sunshine with a wet shirt in her hands and felt terror and joy collide inside her like two trains meeting head-on. She did not tell Silas, not yet. She went to Joe Wheeler. Joe was in her garden turning earth with a spade when Eva rode up. The older woman took one look at Eva's face and set down her tool and said, "Sit down before you fall down." "I think I am pregnant," Eva said. Joe studied her for a long moment, Then she nodded. "You are scared," she said. It was not a question. Terrified. Good. Scared means you know you have got something worth losing. Now go home and tell your husband. Eva rode back to the cabin and found Silas in the corral working with a horse, practicing his grip on the lunge rope. He had been at it for weeks, retraining his damaged hand to hold and guide and control. He was getting better. Slowly, but better. Silas. He turned, saw her face, set down the rope. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Eva said. And then she told him. He did not celebrate. He went pale. The color drained from his face the way it does when a man receives the worst news of his life. And Eva understood why. The last time Silas Boon had heard that he was going to be a father, it had ended with 2 graves behind the cabin and 5 years of living death. "This time is different," Eva said quickly. "I am not Rebecca. You are not who you were 5 years ago. We have Joe nearby. We can get the doctor from the next town. We will be all right." Silas stood in the corral with his damaged hand at his side, and his good hand gripping the fence rail so hard his knuckles went white. He looked at Eva. He looked at the cabin they had rebuilt. He looked at the 2 crosses behind it. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her chest. And she felt him shake again, not from grief this time, from something that had no word big enough to contain it. "We are going to have a baby," he said into her hair. His voice was rough and broken and full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," Eva confirmed, "and we are going to be all right. Late summer." Eva, now visibly pregnant, carried wildflowers behind the cabin to the 2 crosses. She laid them on Rebecca's grave first. White and yellow blossoms that she had picked from the creek bank, where the soil was richest. She arranged them carefully against the weathered wood of the cross, and then she sat down in the warm grass. She was alone. Silas was in the south pasture with the cattle. Joe was at her own ranch. The prairie was quiet except for the wind and the creek and the birds that had returned with the warm weather. Eva sat beside Rebecca Boon's grave and spoke to her. "Thank you," she said, "for loving him first, for teaching him how to love, for this cabin and this land and everything you built that I get to live in now." She put her hand on her belly where the baby was moving. "I promise I will take care of him, and I promise our baby will know your name. Grace Rebecca Boon." That was the name Eva had chosen. Not just remembrance, continuation. Rebecca was not erased or replaced. She was woven into the new story, a thread of gold running through the fabric of everything that came after. Eva sat there for a long time, in the grass beside the 2 graves, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in a graveyard. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something larger than pain. The understanding that life is built on loss, that joy and grief are not opposites, but neighbors, and that the bravest thing you can do is love someone knowing they might be taken away. She had run from Missouri. She had planned Silver Creek. She had spent 8 months building escape routes and contingency plans and backup options because running was the only skill she had ever learned. But here, sitting beside the graves of a woman she never met and a child who never breathed, Eva Merritt Boon finally stopped running. She was home. The baby came in September during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls. Joe Wheeler served as midwife, calm and efficient and firm, with hands that had brought more babies into the world than she could count. The doctor from the neighboring town was there too, summoned a week earlier by Silas, who was not taking any chances. The labor was long, 14 hours. Eva screamed and cursed and gripped Silas's hand so hard she thought she might break his good fingers too. And through it all he sat beside her, and did not look away and did not let go. When the baby came, she came screaming, red-faced and furious and perfect, with a cap of dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Joe Wheeler lifted her up and placed her on Eva's chest, and the baby stopped crying instantly, as if she had found the one place in the world she was meant to be. Silas looked at his daughter, the scarred man who had dug 2 graves behind this cabin, who had spent 3 years living like a dead man, who had been broken by war and grief and rebuilt by stubborn choice and unexpected love, looked at his daughter, and his face transformed. "Hello, little one," he whispered. His voice cracked. His damaged hand reached out, 2 numb fingers in all, and touched the baby's cheek with a gentleness that made Eva's heart ache. "I am your father, and I promise you, I promise, I am going to protect you and love you, and make sure you grow up knowing how lucky we are that you are here." Grace Rebecca Boon, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Born at 9:17 in the evening during the worst thunderstorm Willow Junction had seen in 20 years. Born to a woman who had died once and decided to live again, and a man who had buried his heart in the ground and had it dug back up by a stranger with 17 cents. The cabin had been expanded over the summer. 2 new rooms and a wider porch, built with lumber and labor donated by neighbors who had slowly, grudgingly, and then willingly come around to accepting the Boons as part of their community. Joe Wheeler had supervised the construction with the same firm efficiency she applied to everything. Reverend Mills had blessed the addition. Even Mrs. Patterson had come out with curtains she had sewn herself, though she pretended they were just something she had lying around. A letter had arrived in the spring, postmarked from the territorial prison in Laramie. 2 lines in Marcus Hale's handwriting. "I am not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know Thomas would be glad you are happy. He always wanted you to smile more." Eva had read it, folded it, did not reply. But she did not burn it either. She put it in the wooden chest beside Rebecca's baby shoes, and the letter to Catherine that would never be sent. The past was not erased. It was kept, all of it. The pain and the love and the grief and the guilt, stored carefully in a dark chest, the way you store seeds through winter, knowing that even the hardest things carry the possibility of new growth. Autumn evening. Grace was 3 weeks old and sleeping in the cradle Silas had built with his own hands, working slowly and carefully with his damaged fingers, fitting each piece together with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things cannot be rushed. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of bread hung in the air because Eva had baked that morning, the way she did every Sunday now. On the mantel, a tin cup held late-season wildflowers. Through the window, Eva could see the 2 crosses behind the cabin, and beside them, new flowers she had planted in the spring. They were dormant now, waiting for next year. But they would come back. They always came back. Eva sat on the bed, exhausted and happy and sore, and full of a contentment so deep it felt like it had always been there, just waiting for her to stop running long enough to find it. Silas stood in the doorway, watching her. The firelight played across his scarred face and made the jagged line from ear to jaw look like something earned, rather than something suffered. He was thinner than when she had met him. His right hand would never fully work the same way again. But he was standing in the doorway of a home filled with bread and firelight and a sleeping baby, and the woman who had told him to choose to live. And he was smiling. Not the rusty, cautious smile she had first seen months ago. A full smile, unguarded, radiant with the hard-won joy of a man who had crawled through darkness and come out the other side into light. Eva looked at him. "Where do I sleep?" she said. Her voice was soft and teasing, her eyes bright with love and mischief, and the bone-deep knowledge that she already knew the answer. The same question she had asked on that first night, standing in this cabin with nothing but 17 cents and a broken watch, and a secret she could not bear alone. Silas Boon crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He reached down and pulled the blanket back, the same gesture he had made that first night when she was a stranger and he was a ghost, and he said the words, "Right here." But this time he did not walk to the porch. He lay down beside her and pulled the blanket over them both, and Eva curled into his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Steady, sure, the sound of a man who had chosen to live and was living. The beat of it was regular as hammer strikes on wood, as hoof beats on packed earth, as rain falling on the roof of a home they had built with their own scarred hands. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass the way it always did and always would. It passed over the two graves planted with flowers that would bloom again in spring. It swept past the new barn that Joe Wheeler's crew had raised in a single day, while Eva stood in the yard and cried at the kindness of it. It whispered through the cottonwood trees along the creek where Eva had poured out a bottle of whiskey on a night that felt like 100 years ago. And inside the cabin, in the warm gold light of the fire, a baby slept, and a woman breathed and a man held them both, and the wind could not touch them. Eva closed her eyes. She had died once in Missouri on a kitchen floor in Kansas City, with blood on her hands, and no one to call for help. She had come 1,200 miles with 17 cents and a secret, and a broken watch that marked the exact moment her old life ended. She had followed a scarred stranger into the dark because she was too tired to be afraid of dying. And she had found, in a cabin with two graves behind it, the thing she had stopped believing existed. Home. Not a place, a choice. Made every day in small ways and large, by two people who had every reason to give up and chose not to. "Where do I sleep?" she had asked. "Right here," he had answered. And for the first time in her entire life, Eva Boon did not need to ask where she belonged. She was already there. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.